So welcome everyone. I'm Sibel Halfon. I'm the chair of CAFTR, and I want to welcome you all to our third CAFTR Journal Club. So just to give you a brief context of what CAFTR Journal Club is, this is a space where we get together regularly and discuss recent papers in the field of child, adolescent, and family therapy. And our previous two journal clubs were on Therapeutic Alliance and Epistemic Trust. And today we're very excited to hear two papers that draw on data collected from the Depression Online Therapy Study by Dr. Rose Mortimerr and Liat Leibovich, and Malenka Areas will be our chair, and I'm grateful to them all for accepting our invitation and being with us. So before we move on to the presentations, I just want to say if there are certain topics you would like to learn more about in these journal clubs, please let me know and we can organize a meeting around that topic. Also, please let me know if you'd like to present one of your recent works. We really want this to be an open space where we can engage with each other's work and learn from each other. Okay, so without further delay, I leave the floor to our chair and our presenters.
Well, thank you, Sibel. Hi, everyone. My name is Malenka Areas. I am a PhD student at Universidad de Buenos Aires. And today I will be discussing with, hope, all of you about these presentations. We will hear about Rose and Liat. I will present them. Liat is a clinical psychologist and supervisor in Israel. Her research focuses on mechanisms of change in psychodynamic psychotherapy. She completed her PhD at Universidad of Haifa and her postdoc at Anna Freud Center. Today, she works at the Ahava Children's Village and is responsible for the clinical internship program there. And Dr. Rose Mortimerr, she's a researcher in the Child and Attachment and Psychological Therapies Unit at the Anna Freud Center and a trainee clinical psychologist at University College London. She completed her PhD and a trainee clinical psychologist in bioethics at Oxford University. And her research focuses on themes across psychodynamic psychotherapy, parenting, child mental health. So today, this meeting aims to discuss the findings and implications of two recent papers they collected in Depression Online Therapy Study as a pilot study which was conducted at Anna Freud Center in 2019. Rose's paper examines transcripts of therapy text chat sessions and explore therapeutic alliance in this online treatment. And Liat's work explored how therapists use various techniques and predicted symptom improvement in subsequent sessions. So I will let Rose start with her presentation, and that's all for me.
Thanks, Malenka. Let me just share my screen. Can everybody see that okay? Great. So it's lovely to be here. Thank you, Malenka, for inviting me. I don't know how familiar everybody is with the DOT study. So I presented about the DOT study at the SPR conference in Rome with Jakob and Karen, who are here, who, as I already mentioned, know way more about this than I do. So yes, direct your questions perhaps to them instead of to me, but it's lovely that they're here. And yes, I presented this in Rome, but I wasn't sure how much people know about the study in general. So I thought in the first half of my presentation, I'll just give an overview to the DOTS pilot study, which was conducted at the Anna Freud Center in 2019. And then the second half is focusing on my paper, which looked at therapeutic alliance, looking at some of the transcripts of therapy sessions within the DOT study. So that's sort of a secondary analysis. I don't quite know how long it will take, so I'll whiz through the first half, which outlines the DOT study, see where we're at for time, and then hopefully we'll have time to look at Therapeutic Alliance as well, but obviously want to make sure we have time for Liat and for questions. So yeah, we'll see how we go. But please do stop me at any point for questions, just shout out. That's absolutely fine. Hopefully it can be quite informal. So let's go to my next slide. Yes, so the DOT study stands for Depression Online Therapy Study. And a bit of background, I'm sure everyone's very aware of all of this already, but as we know, depression is a major problem for adults and adolescents alike worldwide. And although we have effective face-to-face treatment for depression, there are huge barriers to accessing face-to-face services, again, worldwide. So waiting times are huge in the NHS, at least. Private therapy is expensive. And for young people, particularly, there are additional barriers in terms of relying on parents or carers for payment for private therapy or for transportation to therapy sessions, for consent for therapy sessions. So there are lots and lots of barriers that young people particularly face when accessing therapy. So online therapy is an alternative to face-to-face therapy that perhaps has less barriers or different barriers to accessing it. And there have been a number of online therapies that have been developed for depression, but most of these have been developed for adults and most use a CBT framework. Except the first psychodynamic treatment for adolescent depression, particularly, which was developed by Jakob and Karin in Sweden. And there've now been 2 randomized control trials evaluating that therapy, which have found it to be effective and non-inferior to online CBT for adolescent depression. So really promising findings. When we conducted the DOT study, both those RCTs, they hadn't both been finalized. One of them had been finalized, I think, just about. So at that point, we sort of weren't as convinced as we are now of the effectiveness of the treatment. And we also hadn't tried it out in the UK. So the goal of the DOT study was to take this IPDT treatment developed in Sweden, which looked very promising, to translate it into English and to pilot it with a UK adolescent population and culturally adapt it for a UK context to try it out, basically. And we, like I say, we were doing this in 2019 during the pandemic without any funding. So it was a sort of a group effort to get this off the ground. Before I say much about the study, just to very quickly outline the treatment program. So it's affect-focused psychotherapy is the sort of psychodynamic framework, and it uses Malan's triangle of conflict as sort of a main theme of the treatment. There's a little image of that there, and the way we sort of explain that to the young people during the treatment is that we might have learned in life that there are certain emotions that are threatening to key relationships, and when those emotions are triggered by external events, we feel anxiety because they are sort of threatening emotions, and we try to suppress them and we use defenses. So the idea is that we sort of help the young people to identify what defenses they might be using, to identify when they're feeling anxiety, to think about sort of their interpersonal patterns, and maybe to begin to come a bit closer to the feelings at the bottom of the triangle that are perhaps feared. In a nutshell, that's a very simplified version. The treatment has 8 chapters or modules, which are sort of online, like a website, which you access sort of roughly 1 treatment chapter a week over 10 weeks. So there's a bit of wiggle room if it takes a bit longer. And the chapter content is a mixture of text, like psychoeducation, videos that they can watch, audio clips, and worksheets that they can fill in. And this is a therapist guided program. So they access them, read the treatments on their own in their own time, quite flexibly. But each week they have a roughly 30-minute instant messaging chat session with their therapists. So a bit like a kind of WhatsApp conversation, but within the platform online, where they discuss the chapter content, and the therapist sort of helps them reflect on the content, personalize it to their situation. When they fill in their worksheets, the worksheet responses get sort of sent off to the therapist, and the therapist will also send, in addition to the instant messaging chat, will send a sort of feedback message to the young person in response to their worksheet. I'll show you a bit more of the platform in a bit to sort of bring that to life, but that's sort of in a nutshell what the treatment program looks like. And as I said, the DOT study was trying to adapt, translate this program, and to run a small pilot study. So we were looking at sort of recruitment and retention rates, the acceptability of the program to the young people, sort of looking at engagement and dropout, and also preliminary data on the effectiveness. And we recruited 23 young people. So it's a very small study. The RCTs in Sweden are much, much, much bigger, but this was just a sort of preliminary pilot. And I won't go into this, but we can come back to it if you're interested, giving a bit of a breakdown of the demographics of the young people, which I guess is interesting when we're thinking about which groups of young people particularly are interested in an online program. Is this more appealing to some groups than others? And the measures that we used. So one of the benefits of an online program like this one is that you can relatively easily do weekly measures, because young people get a sort of email or text reminder to fill in their questionnaire measures every week. Obviously, there still is lots of missing data, but it's easier than handing out, questionnaires on paper. So we had weekly measures of depression, anxiety, emotion regulation. I can't remember if that was weekly or just at beginning and end point. Might have been weekly. And then we also had the Session Alliance inventory weekly. And the young people were told that their therapists couldn't see their scores on the Alliance inventory. And then we had obviously outcome data at the end of the 10-week intervention, and then we did a 3-month follow-up as well. This is what the UK version looked like, the platform where the young people would access the therapy content. So as just to give you a rough idea, so you can imagine it, we've got the 8 chapters here, so they click on a chapter each week. The chapter is broken up down the side here into sort of little subsections. And then this is sort of what the worksheet might look like. So these are kind of text boxes to put in responses. Some of the worksheets are more like a kind of Likert scale, or clicking around in that way. But the worksheets really help, I think, the young people to reflect on how the content of the stuff that they're reading applies to them. So this one, for example, how have emotions been received and handled in the environment where you grew up? So getting them to think about the chapter content in their own lives. And I think Liat later will show us more about what a chat session looks like, but this again is just to give you a bit of an idea. This is me and one of the young people chatting a bit about the content of the chapter in the week and how that young person was finding it. Okay, and then the findings, this has been a very rapid run through of this study, but the findings, the outcomes of the study showed that there was a statistically significant change in depression and emotion regulation by the end of the study, but not anxiety, which was interesting because the Swedish studies had found an improvement in anxiety symptoms, which we didn't find. We did find a change in depression and emotion regulation. And we wondered whether possibly, I don't know, but the not seeing the change in anxiety could have been because the intervention was finishing around exam time for the young people. So possibly it was a timing thing, that they were all very anxious about their exams anyway. I don't know if that was the case, but that's a bit of a hunch. So if we did run it again, I think we'd try running it at a different sort of time in the school year and see how that, if that made a difference. I won't go through the more complicated statistical paragraph, but if people are interested, we can come back to that. And then with regards to engagement and acceptability, so As I said, it was only a small study, but 21 of the 23 young people did remain in the study until the end, which I feel was quite a good outcome. And there was just one young person who didn't begin the program, didn't open a single sort of chapter or engage in any interaction with their therapist. And I think the data seems to show that young people particularly valued the instant messaging chats. So the average number of chat sessions was 8.4 over a possible of 10. 10 would be one per week. So most young people were going to almost all of their chat sessions, whereas engagement with the chapter content dropped off a little bit over time, which again might be due to the sort of clashing with exam season and young people feeling that they didn't have time to read the chapters. I think, yes, those are all my slides on the overview of the study. Shall I pause here? I don't know if anyone has any questions at this point about the study itself or anything I've said so far.
It was really clear. So maybe if there are no questions, we can continue with your paper.
Great. Okay, that's excellent. I've got time. If I'm speaking really fast, please tell me to slow down. I'm also aware there's a range of first languages in the room and I'm rattling through in rapid English. So this is the sub-study that we used secondary data analysis, I guess, which was looking particularly at therapeutic alliance. So I was really interested in this idea of therapeutic alliance in a sort of online context, and particularly, you know, in the psychodynamic theory, we're very interested in relationship between the client and the therapist. In this study, there's no face-to-face interaction at all. We didn't even provide sort of photos of the therapist. So the young person had no idea what the person that they were speaking with looks like, sounds like. There's no facial expressions, there's no tone of voice. So I was interested in how alliance is built, what sort of techniques therapists are using to build and maintain alliance, and sort of what a good alliance looks like in this sort of text-based format. So what I did was I looked at, I remember I said the young people were giving a score, they were rating the session alliance inventory each week. So what I did was look at all of the cases and find a subsample where we had 4 cases where the young person consistently rated the alliance as very high the whole way through. So I kind of considered those my high alliance cases. And then I found 3 where the young person's ratings were showing a distinctly sort of improving trajectory, which was sort of my growing alliance cases. And what I wanted to do was look at the transcripts of the chat sessions that were happening each week, and also the midweek feedback messages in response to worksheets, and think about, is there anything that is happening in all of the high alliance cases, anything that the therapist is doing or that the young person is doing that sort of seems to characterize a strong alliance from the start? And then equally, is there anything that seems to be changing in the growing alliance cases that could show that the alliance appears to be strengthening or improving? And I showed there the at the bottom there in that table, just the kind of the mean alliance score each week. So the top score on this session alliance inventory is 30. So there was a pretty much, most cases had a strong alliance, and that has been found in other studies of online therapy. So this is not particularly unusual. And generally the alliance seemed to, across the board, roughly grow a little bit week on week, peak in around week 8, and then drop off a little bit towards the end, which might be something to do with therapy ending. But that was just to give you an idea of how the whole sample looks. Okay. Next slide. And this maps out the cases that I took as my subsample. So I don't know if you can see my cursor, but these ones at the top were my high alliance cases. So they started almost at 30 or at 30, and then they've stayed at 30 pretty much the whole time. So 100% amazing alliance according to the young people. And these are my growing alliance cases. So they've started around sort of 14, 15, 16, which were the kind of lowest scores that anyone gave for the whole time. And then they've mostly have been improving. This one comes up to a 30 by the end, but this one's finishes at around a 25, and this one I think around a 20. So they seem to be growing. Okay, I will whiz very quickly through the findings, and then we can discuss them if we have time. So yeah, I was looking at the text transcripts of the chat sessions and also the midweek messaging. So although it looks like a very small sample, there was a lot of data. So I had in total 49 transcripts of chat sessions and 70 midweek messaging conversations. And the themes that I sort of found were around this theme of togetherness, this theme of hope, and a theme of agency. So I'll just quickly demonstrate what those themes sort of look like in practice. And this is focusing on what the therapists were doing. I did also look at what the young people were saying, but I haven't got time to go into that now. So I'm just going to focus on sort of therapist techniques that seem to be fostering these kind of values that seem to be building or maintaining a strong alliance. So under this theme of togetherness, there was we-ness, as I called it, positivity and care, and the idea of another mind. So we-ness was the therapist really creating this sense of there's two of us here. So just things like, this may be something that we need to return to together next week. Sort of, we're in this together. Positivity and care was this idea that the therapist was holding the young person in mind between sessions and genuinely caring sort of about what happened to them and being very positive about their relationship. So something like, it was so nice to hear from you on Wednesday, and I was glad to hear that this week was feeling a bit more manageable. And then finally, this idea of another mind, which I think links a bit to kind of mentalizing, in that the therapist was using a lot of sort of mental states language to draw attention to the fact that they were a real person at the end of the conversation who had a mind and was capable of holding the young person in mind. So rather than just saying, do these self-critical thoughts make you feel worse, they would phrase it along the lines of, would I be right in thinking that these self-critical thoughts make you feel much worse? Which takes longer to type, but really creates a sense of someone wondering, someone who's curious about you. Second theme was agency. So the therapeutic support workers were trying to provide choices to the young person. So giving options. What do you want to focus on today? Do you want to look at the chapter content? Do you want to look at your worksheet? Really making sure that there were options. And then also this idea of collaboration and teamwork. So it sounds to me like when there's conversations about exams, you experience some difficult feelings, which triggers anxiety. Does any part of this resonate with you? If not, I would really like for you to correct me and think with me about this. So sort of encouraging the young person to take ownership of the session, to disagree, to share their opinion, and to kind of work things out together. Which I think links to this theme of agency, because it's really sort of given the young person a say in how the session goes. And then finally, hope. So there was this theme of praise and progress, where these are young people experiencing depression. Sort of by definition, they're probably not very hopeful and they're not feeling very good about themselves. And it felt like the therapeutic support workers were really sort of linking the changes that they saw the young person making to the progress that they saw the young person making, to sort of make that connection really explicit and to really praise the effort. So for example, I was thinking about you today and reflecting on the progress you've made. In your worksheet, you mentioned challenging the inner critic more. I think that's absolutely brilliant. 8 weeks ago, you would have just believed that voice and ended up feeling really bad about yourself. But now you're trying to notice that voice. That's such a big step towards recovery. So that's quite self-explanatory. And then also this idea of preempting the inner critic. So sort of noticing when the young person might be likely to criticize themselves and getting in there first. So maybe suggesting a task for homework, but being quick to say, you know, if you can't do it, that's okay. Even if you just try, that's fine. If it's too big a step, we can talk about it. I know this takes a lot of effort. You're doing really well. Just this kind of unconditional positive regard, and yeah, helping the young person not to criticize themselves too much. I'm aware of time, so I'm going to stop there, but those are the links to the 2 papers. And yeah, plenty more I could say, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And do people have any questions now, or we can also save them for after Liat has spoken to us? Should we hand over to you, Liat?
All right. Wait, I'll share my screen. Okay. Okay, so this is, thank you, Rose. I will thank you soon. This is the name of my talk, Unpacking the Active Ingredients of Internet-Based Psychodynamic Therapy for Adolescents. This is also the name of the article. I will read it with you, so I hope you can understand my English, because speaking after Rose is challenging. Okay, maybe I can, yeah. Okay, so hi everybody. Thank you for having me here, and thank you, Rose, for inviting me and being once again so generous and insightful when introducing the dots and talking about your unique and innovative research. Rose was the one person in this project who did everything and was everywhere, and is the first to thank for its success. I'm very excited to talk to you today about our research. I don't know how many of you are therapists or apply psychodynamic psychotherapy. I've been a psychodynamic psychotherapist for more than 2 decades, and am always curious about what is it that facilitates change in psychotherapy. I had this wonderful opportunity to join the DOTS project as a postdoc student at the Anna Ford Center with Professor Nick Midgley as my supervisor and mentor. In a somewhat parallel process to the DOTS, I participated in the project while in Israel during the COVID pandemic and lockdowns, connecting via video conferences, sharing documents and Google and email, just like the DOTS project itself. When I joined the team planning the project and getting the ethical approval, I was pleased that Professor Midgley thought it was a good idea to add an inventory, one more inventory. Rose showed you all the inventories, but there was one more, which was specific for the therapeutic support workers, that each of them was asked to fill out after every chat session, where they could list the interventions and techniques they used during the session. This inventory is called the Multi-30, and was developed by Kevin McCarthy, Nili Solomonov, and Jack Barber to assess the use of interventions across therapeutic orientations. So this was a specific inventory that only the therapists filled. When we started the project, very little was known about the techniques used in internet-based psychodynamic psychotherapy in general, and for adolescents in particular. Earlier work by Jacob and Karine, who developed this specific therapy, showed that emotion regulation was a mediator of outcome, but was not directly connected to a specific technique. So that we didn't know which techniques were facilitated emotion regulation. Therefore, it seemed both interesting and important to find out which techniques were used in the chat sessions and whether they contributed to adherence to therapy and to change in depressive symptoms. So these are the aims of this study. And the Multi-30 inventory, the therapist rate items on a 5-point Likert scale from 1, not typical to the session, to 5, very typical to the session, based on the intensity and frequency of their use of interventions at the end of each session, after each chat session. These interventions were clustered into 8 main therapeutic orientations, including psychodynamic, common factors, and CBT. The psychodynamic cluster, which we are mostly interested in, includes interventions such as connecting the here and now to the past, exploring avoided feelings, dreams, fantasies, and functions of behaviors, and exploring the transference. The common factors cluster, which is most similar to supportive. These are therapeutic support workers, so they're doing also supportive work. It describes interventions that are assumed to be shared by all approaches, such as attentive listening, expressive of warmth, empathy, and support, expressing hope and encouragement, like Rose showed us, and working together as a team. This was also something Rose showed. To illustrate what these interventions can look like in a chat session, I will use the following vignette taken from the third chat session between Dana and Anne. These, of course, are not their names, and turned out to be a high alliance and successful therapy. Rose agreed that we could use this vignette and revealed that she is Dana, the therapeutic support worker. This session started with the common factors techniques, giving hope and encouragement, being warm and sympathetic, working together as a team. And it was followed by psychodynamic techniques, encouraging the patient to explore emotions she usually avoided, making connections between the current situation and the best. I will show the techniques, but of course we are not coding specific techniques, but we hope that the therapeutic support workers will notice their techniques and code and rate the inventory in accordance to it. Okay. So here are some common factors interventions from the beginning of the session. So then Rose said, well done for filling the chapter 3 worksheets this week. I was really proud to see how you completed all of them. And she also said, that seems like a very important thing to have noticed. When you feel tough emotions like sadness or maybe anger sometimes, you panic and feel the anxiety. Am I being right here? Please correct me if I'm wrong. If I'm not, this is also, of course, similar to the mentalizing Rose talked about before. And another example for what we think of as common factors, it's really, really good that you're spotting the self-criticism. Whilst the experience of self-criticism is horrible, I'm really impressed that you've noticed it. That's the first step toward challenging it. This is, of course, like showing hope and encouragement. Okay, I think maybe you are curious to see psychodynamic interventions, how they look like in chat sessions. So we have here some examples of psychodynamic interventions from this same chat session. It's the middle part of the session. The chat sessions are quite long, some of them. So they were chatting about Anne's anxiety around the relationship with her girlfriend. She has a girlfriend. So Dana writes, I see, that sounds really tough for you. So your fear of being abandoned or forgotten by her leads to difficult feelings, maybe sadness. Do you ever feel angry with her for not responding to messages or not being in touch as much as you'd like? So Anne says, yeah, very angry and upset. And then writes, do you ever express those emotions to your girlfriend? And writes, yes, I sometimes shout or cry. Then, okay, sounds like maybe you show her your emotions, but perhaps it's a little bit hard to talk about it with her. And yeah, because it's hard to explain something when she doesn't really feel the same way. And says, and she writes again, and I find I start getting angry or upset. So Dana writes, I see, yes, I totally understand. It's hard to explain to her when she experiences it differently and doesn't understand. Do you remember when you chatted before and I suggested that shouting and crying can be defenses and responses to anxiety? I wonder whether you sometimes feel a bit angry at her, but you try to hold that anger back because you don't want to upset her. But then if you hold it in long enough, it builds up and you explode. That's just a guess. Please tell me if I'm wrong. She's kind of like bringing in an interpretation of the defenses. And writes, yeah, definitely. I try to hold back my anger and then it becomes overwhelming. So Dana writes, this is really important and you're spotting lots of different parts of the triangle. So if we map it out, the feelings at the bottom are sadness and anger, triggered by her not being in touch as much as you'd like. As you start the worry that she may abandon or forget you. Then there's anxiety because you don't want to feel these feelings. They feel like a risk to the relationship because they might drive her away. But then you have the defenses, self-criticism, and after a while, exploding anger and tears. Then, right, so I'm wondering where that fear of being abandoned might have come. Then writes again. She's asking, where does it come from? She's trying to connect it to the past. It's another psychodynamic technique. It's a very common worry, and often we learn it in our early relationships. This is kind of like psychoeducation. Do you have any idea why you may worry so much about her leaving you? So, and writes, yeah, that's really helped to kind of represent a step-by-step my emotions. And I'm not sure really. I think it's because I feel more comfortable with her there because she's helped me a lot with my parents' separation. So of course, this is kind of like squeezing it, but so what I try to show are the common factors techniques at the beginning and the psychodynamic techniques. Of encouraging the patient to explore emotions she avoids, and making connection between the current situation and the past. So I hope this is more clear, like what techniques we're actually looking for. So why use the multi to understand the techniques? The multi-30 is widely used in RCTs, and it takes only about 5 minutes to fill in. It generates a score of common factors and psychodynamic techniques, which are the ones that interest us, but also for CBT techniques, which we wanted to rule out as major change mechanisms. We also wanted to see if maybe CBT techniques were the ones that created change, even though it's a psychodynamic therapy. The disadvantages were that it might, of course, be less objective than an outside observer's rating. I mean, people rate their own sessions. So it has pros and cons. So what did we find? Our first question was descriptive. What techniques were used and how often? Of course, how does the therapeutic support workers observe their techniques? As you can see in table 1, the common factors techniques were used more often. We can see it here. And the psychodynamic techniques were not more frequent than CBT techniques. So actually, the therapeutic support workers did not use more psychodynamic techniques than CBT techniques. This one was in line with the protocol of the therapy, which advised the therapeutic support workers to be as supportive as possible. And to be careful in their psychodynamic interventions because they can also create ruptures. And the assumption was that ruptures in therapy would not be easily detected and repaired. So it's kind of dangerous to have ruptures in a chat session. This finding might also suggest that the therapists feeling in the multi after each session were very honest and not overly worried about meeting expectations. They were not worried about talking about reporting that they used CBT interventions, for example. So they just filled it as, we hope, honestly. So this was our first finding. Our second question was adherence. Does using specific techniques contribute to adherence to therapy? In internet-based interventions, adherence is usually considered to be the number of modules opened and the number of chat sessions attended. So we correlated the mean rate of the techniques to treatment adherence and found no significant correlations. However, one cluster of techniques came very close to being statistically significant, namely the psychodynamic subscale. Hence, there seems to be a trend that more psychodynamic techniques lead to higher adherence. This is interesting because we said that it might also lead to ruptures, but no, it actually led to higher adherence. And finally, I'm almost finishing. This was our last question, and I think our most interesting question. Is there a connection between therapeutic techniques and changes in depression? Can we find some connection? Here, first, I want to express my gratitude to Corinne and Jacob, two of the most talented people I know, who not only developed the treatment and supervised the therapist in Sweden and in England. They have much better English than mine, but also calculated all the complicated statistics I will now try to describe very briefly. So I really want to express my gratitude. Okay, so let's try to understand here what we were looking for. There are two different ways to think about the question of ways to look at the possible connections between technique and change in depression symptoms. And I want to remind you that the young people filled out a questionnaire examining their depressive symptoms every week. So we had questionnaires examining depressive symptoms every week. Okay. The first and simpler way to look at the connection is to examine whether more techniques in the chat sessions were correlated with more improvement in therapy in general. This type of analysis is called between patient analysis. This analysis showed that only the common factors were significantly correlated to outcome. That is, the more a therapeutic support worker used common factors, the better the outcome was. Or expressed differently, successful therapies enable the therapeutic support worker to be more supportive, because we can't know which was the first to contribute, right? So again, the successful therapies in terms of the depression were more supportive, used more common factors. This is what one finding. We can see the statistics here. I don't know if you see do you see it? So here we see that common factors, we looked at psychodynamic, common factors, cognitive and behavioral. And I will tell you that the other ones are also not significant, of course. We couldn't put them all in one table. So if we look at between person, only the common factors are significant. Okay, so this is the between person effect. The second, more complex way to look at this association between techniques and depression is to examine the connection between the techniques used in a chat session and the depression rating which followed that specific session. This type of analysis is called within-patient analysis because we look session by session. When Jacob and Corinne did the analysis, we found that only the psychodynamic subscale produced significant results. This means that more use of psychodynamic techniques actually predicted an improvement in symptoms the next week. Since we controlled for the effect of time, because we had a time effect, as time progressed, there was also general improvement with no connection to techniques. And also we looked at the reverse effect. We looked at whether improvement in depression predicted psychodynamic techniques. And it's not, because you can say that maybe they used more psychodynamic techniques because they were less depressed. So maybe this is the connection, but no, it's not the connection. We can control, they could, of course, they control all these stuff. And it seems that psychodynamic techniques in the DOTS chat session predicted improvement in depressive symptoms. So again, if we look at this table, we can see that the within-person effect here was only statistically significant in the psychodynamic subscale and not in the other subscales. Okay, so to summarize the results, again, only the common factors techniques exhibited the more the better effect or between patient effect, and only psychodynamic techniques predicted change in depression at the next session. That is the within patient effect. Okay, so what can I conclude from all this? The first conclusion is that since it is now safer to fly, I really want to come to London to meet as many members of this extraordinary team as possible, and especially Rose here and Professor Midgley in person, which I didn't meet them in person. And clearly connecting over the internet should just be the beginning. And the second conclusion is that both common factors and psychodynamic techniques are important in internet-based psychodynamic psychotherapy. So therapists should be encouraged to learn them and to use them properly. This is our paper. Thank you again, Jacob and Corinne and Rose and Julian and Nick Midgley. And thank you all for your attention. Back to you, Malenka.
No, thanks you and Rose for being here. I know it's a lot of work and a lot of your time too to present and to organize this. So thanks for your participation. I don't know if someone wants to say something or ask something?
I could ask if it's okay. So first, thank you. It's great to hear this study. I didn't know the details well, so I got a really good sense of the kinds of interventions that are being practiced and the aims of therapy. So I have a question to Rose. Have you also looked at alliance outcome relations, or was yours just a qualitative study?
So my study was just qualitative. But I think, I don't know whether Liat or Jakob and Karen can remember, I think we didn't find any relation, did we, between alliance and outcome overall?
That's very interesting, because I thought like the common factors variable is probably quite associated with supportive techniques and therapeutic alliance.
Not statistically significant, but we had also a very small sample.
Yeah, I know. So most of it is. My second question is about the alliance measure you chose. It was for the measure is developed for face-to-face therapy, right?
Yeah.
So how do you think that factored into what you found? I think it's fascinating. I'm so curious about how the adolescents conceived the therapist, and what alliance really means in internet-based therapy. So would love to hear your thoughts on that.
That's a great question. I was just going to pause because I saw that Jakob unmuted briefly, and I don't know, Jakob, if you wanted to respond to the first question before I go on to the second one.
No, go on, Rose.
You sure? Okay, maybe you'll come back in. Yeah, so this was also a question of mine, sort of, is this questionnaire the right one? It was developed for face-to-face, and it was developed for week by week. So that's partly why we used it, because it's a useful sort of weekly measure. And I would be really interested to do some kind of qualitative work with young people and find out, in the context of an internet-based treatment, what do you think is important? And the SAI takes the sort of tasks, goals, bond structure of alliance, which does seem to apply to an online therapy. I think that structure just generally does seem to apply, in that when I was looking at the qualitative data, it looked, when you look at the subscales of the questionnaire, it looked like the sort of togetherness, mentalizing stuff, use of those techniques seemed to particularly not correlate statistically, but looked like it correlated with the bond aspect of the alliance rating, and then the stuff around sort of togetherness, collaboration, that seemed to link more to the goals and tasks. So it did seem like there was this connection where the therapist was building a bond through creating a sense of a genuine relationship, but also by encouraging the young person to have a say in what they wanted to do, in linking their progress to their outcomes. There was also this sort of building confidence in the tasks and the goals of therapy. But yeah, I don't have a good answer, but except that I think it's a really good question, and I think it would be really interesting. And I know that there has been work done looking at different alliance measures, even for like sort of virtual reality therapy and things like that. So there's definitely scope for more work, I think. Other people may know more about those other measures than I do.
Great, thank you.
Well, maybe
I could perhaps add something, because since DOTS is a very small study, obviously there was limited statistical power, but we are now, as we have conducted a larger non-inferiority trial in Sweden with 270 adolescents. We're actually right now preparing a paper on the effect of lagged within effects of alliance and outcome, and there seems to be an effect. It's not published yet, so I can't tell you the details of it, but there seems to be also that sort of driving causality factor within the internet-based format. I think we chose this measure, and I think that's also why it was used in DOTS. I think we reasoned sort of very similarly because it's very brief, so we can use it weekly without burdening them too much. And also there's quite a lot of contact in this treatment compared to normal guided self-help because of the chat session. So actually there's a lot of interaction, and the adolescents, I think Rose would agree with me that they can create quite a strikingly strong bond actually with it, although they never meet and although it's only text-based. When we interview them, they describe a really intense relationship with a therapeutic support worker, and I know Rose had many of those relationships with her clients in the trial.
Yeah, I think I was surprised by how much I felt I really could, rightly or wrongly, have a sense of who this young person was and a genuine care about them. So when I was sort of showing those techniques around care and positivity, that was genuine. Like I did feel I really did care for the young people, and I think the other TSWs did as well. And I wonder whether that is surprising to me as someone who didn't grow up with the internet as such, but for the young people who are, you know, digital natives and have grown up with the internet, I don't think that's surprising to them. That's how they do so many of their relationships and online dating and like all this kind of stuff. So I think for them, they're very comfortable with that, and it's maybe for us that we're not so much. But I think it was interesting that the therapeutic support workers in the DOT study were all sort of my age, so they were kind of like postgraduate students, that's like sort of in between age of people who didn't grow up with the internet but acquired it in their sort of teenage or later teenage years. And it would be interesting, I think, if we had sort of more experienced but older therapists doing this kind of work in an online therapy, how they would find that if they are not quite so used potentially to kind of forming relationships over the internet. I think that would be interesting to find out more about.
Yes, I would like to say, like, first of all, Liat, your English was perfect. I also feel nervous when I have to speak in English because it's not my native language, but everything was very clear. And I think one of the things that is very interesting for me here is that this journal club like embraces much more than DOTS project for me too. Like understanding that all of you, Liat, Jacob, Rose, Karin, it's very challenging working with something so new. It's a new paradigm, and I feel like it's very interesting thinking about how therapeutic alliance is changing also, and which training we receive as therapists, and how is it that maybe adolescents feel much more comfortable with this kind of interactions, and how we did not receive maybe training in this kind of interventions, and also maybe when we don't know very much about the program and we think, okay, it has some chapters, so it will be very structured, but then adolescents value like these personalized treatments. And when we see how you interact with the adolescents, we see like there's a personalized intervention. So I feel like really it's very interesting and very challenging. So that is something that maybe I am still thinking about, like training, how to train also therapists for being able to work with this, because we are seeing that it works. So if it works, we need to train therapists so that they can also work with this.
And I guess to add, I mean, I'm not a therapist, right? I'm training now, but I wasn't training when I was a therapist in this study. So it seems that relatively inexperienced postgraduate students can can deliver this therapy and it be effective. I don't know whether it would be more effective with therapists who have more years of experience and training. I don't know, but that, I guess, is also helpful when thinking about cost effectiveness and things, that you don't need your most expensive experienced therapist necessarily to deliver the program. I think that was also true in Sweden, right? That they were sort of trainees or relatively new therapists.
Yes, but they were relatively more experienced than the British therapists, because they had some clinical experience. They were psychologists in their final semester of training, so they actually had some clinical work. So they were relatively more experienced, but they were obviously still very inexperienced. But you do get quite a lot of supervision, which hopefully was helpful. And I think this kind of work, even though I developed the treatment with Karin, I was really skeptical of this. I thought it won't work. It shouldn't work. I still don't really understand why it does work. But I've come to really value it as a sort of graded approach to learning therapy, because you do get more time to think. You're not constantly under fire as you are within the consulting room. So this, I think, and a lot of our students have actually expressed just that, how valuable this was to them, and that they could take this with them into their clinical work, doing face-to-face therapy as well. So I think it's certainly something to think about when doing training.
Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing how helpful it can be that you've got this transcript, which you don't normally have unless you've recorded a therapy session, which is relatively rare. So, I mean, it can also be a rod to beat yourself with when you go back. Oh, why did I say that? That was the worst thing to say. But it is an amazing learning tool. And I think also for the young people, I don't know how many of them go back and reread the transcripts of their sessions, but they can if they want to. And again, that I think is something that is really valuable, because when you're in therapy, you often, you don't remember 90% of what was said to you in the session, and that having that option to go back and revisit, I think is really, really useful.
I don't know if there's something else someone maybe want to share. Well, I don't know, Sibyl, if we are on time, maybe we can end this meeting here. I don't know.
Yeah, I think we're just on time. So thank you everyone for being here, and thank you Liat, Rose, Malenka, for sharing this work with us. I think it was very clear, very informative, and very interesting to think about these concepts in the context of internet-based therapy. So thank you so much for presenting this wonderful work to us.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you again. Thank you, Jacob and Karin and Rose. It was great seeing you again. I agreed to come just so I can meet Rose. I didn't know that Jacob and Karin are coming too, so it's great. And thank you all for inviting me, and good luck with your seminar.
Thank you.
Lovely to see you, Liat. We'll be in touch.
Thank you a lot.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.